Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Shell by Example, the series where we learn how to use the UNIX shell by actually interacting with it. So if you haven't seen the previous episodes and you want to check them out, then go ahead and check out the playlist linked right up here. So today we're going to go over how to run executables and use that to discuss file permissions as well. So we have some experience running commands now, like cd and ls and all of those. But where do those commands actually live? They're not just baked magically into our shell, they're actual executables that you would run just like if you were to run a program from anywhere else. So to find out the different places where those commands are, we can use the where command. So if we type where cd, for example, we can see that cd is actually in /usr/bin/cd. But how does our shell actually know to look there when we type cd? So the way that it does this is by using something called the path. So the path is an environment variable, which is just a thing that your shell is keeping track of, that defines the different places where we want to check for executables whenever we run something. So if we want to see our actual path, you can go ahead and run echo $path, which is the environment variable for path, and you'll get a whole long string. Yours will probably be slightly different from mine because I have Anaconda installed and I have a separate install for Homebrew and things like that. But it will generally look something like this. So what is going on here is this is just a string of different locations separated by colons that define the different places to look for executables. So this is great for programs that we actually install, but what about if we just install an executable or a script and we want to run it? So then it's not actually going to be on our path. It's probably going to be in your downloads, or if you wrote it, it might be in your, I don't know, wherever you put your projects. So if we want to run things like that, we're going to have to run files that are actually in our file system. So to run an executable, you can simply type the path to it, and that will run it. So for example, right now, if I move out here, if I want to run something in my scripts directory, I can just type scripts/test.sh, and it will run it. So you can go ahead and try this too with either a script that you wrote, or you can use my example directory, and this will allow you to actually run a script or an executable or whatever you're trying to run. The one thing to note with this form though is that if you are not in the same if you are in the same directory rather as the executable you're trying to run, you will have to prepend it with a // because otherwise it's going to try to look for that executable that you're naming on your path instead of looking where you currently are. So if I cd into my scripts directory and I just type test.sh, you're going to see that it's not going to work because it's not going to find that command. But if I type /test.sh, then it runs just as we expect. So now we can try to run the other things in here. Something called restricted. That looks interesting. But if I run that, I get a permission denied error. So what this error is saying is that we don't have permission to execute this file. So this leads us perfectly into talking about file permissions. So if you think back to episode 1, we talked about different flags for ls, and one of the things we talked about was the -l command, was the -l flag rather. So this gives us a long output of all of the things here. I'm going to go ahead and run you through what is going on here. So here we have a much longer line for each of our files instead of just the name of the file like we did before. We have this weird looking string, and then we have some other stuff here. So this is whoever owns the file. This is the group that owns the file. This is when it was created, and this is the permissions. So what the permissions are is just a definition of who's allowed to do what with this file. So we can break this down really easily into 3 different sections, and then from there into 3 different types. So the first section is the first 3 characters after this initial dash, and this defines the permissions that the owner has. So that is the owner who's listed right here. Then our next 3 characters right here, the 3 characters after that in the middle, are going to be the permission that the group has, and that's going to be the group talked about right here. And then finally, these 3 right here are going to be the permissions that anyone else on the computer has. So this is going to be permissions that anyone, regardless of whether they're the owner or belong to that group or whatever, have with this file. So these are also broken down by the letters that you see here, where read, and that's always going to be in the first position, is our ability to read, and it's represented by an R. W is the same but for write, and it's in the second position. And then finally in the third position is X for execute. And that talks about who can actually run that file. So once we go through that, that's great, but let's say we want to be able to run something that we currently don't have permission to run. Well, luckily, we can just change those permissions. So first, we're going to talk about the chmod or change modes command. So the change modes command is the thing that we use to edit file permissions. There are 2 simple syntaxes that can be used to edit these permissions, and we're going to be going over both of them here. So first thing to note is actually we're just going to take a quick detour here to talk about super users. So if you downloaded this from my Git repository directly using Git, I might still be the owner of that file. If you run ls-l and you see that Aiden is the owner of your directory and your username is not Aiden, then what is happening there is that I'm still the owner of the file, and therefore you might not have permissions to do almost anything with it except for what's defined in the everyone else category. So to remedy this, we can go ahead and use our abilities as an administrator on your computer, assuming that you are one. If you're not, then you're kind of out of luck for a lot of things, and you should get administrator rights on your computer, because otherwise it's going to be difficult for you to do a lot of things in your shell. And we can use the sudo command, which is super user do. And we can say, do this thing as a super user. So a super user is a user that has permission to do pretty much anything on your computer, depending on how your computer is set up. So we're going to need this, if I'm still the owner of those files, when you are doing things with Chmod, which we're going to talk about in a second. So if you run anything and it tells you permission denied in the next following thing, unless I say it should give you permission denied, try prepending it with sudo and see if that works for you then. So now moving into Chmod. Chmod is the change modes command, and we are going to use that to edit the permissions on our files. So the first thing we're going to go over is the verbose method. So here, we're going to build up a string with 3 different characters, or 3 different sections. And with those, we're going to define the permissions on our thing. So the first string of characters is either going to be U, G, O, or A, or some combination of those, where U, which stands for user, which means owner. It's confusing that it's called different things in different places, but whatever. G is for group, O is for other, and then A is for all. So you can use any combination of U, G, and O, or you could just use A to set things for all. And this is going to define whose permissions you're editing. So then our next group of blocks is either going to be plus, minus, or equals, where plus means add the following permissions, minus means take away the following permissions, and equals means set the following permissions to be exactly the permissions that this person has. So then finally after that, we're going to have read, write, and execute, which are our 3 different permissions that we can assign. So if we want to go ahead and be able to run that restricted file, then first we can ls-l. Let's see what permissions it has right now. Well, right now, nobody has execution permissions. Let's say we want everyone to be able to execute that file, so it's just not a problem at all for anyone anymore. Then we can chmod a for all plus x onto restricted.sh. And now if we ls-l again, then we can see everyone now has execute permissions, and we can go ahead and run /restricted, and we get the output, which is just echoing you need permission to run me. So once we have that done, that is a basic way of how to do the verbose editing. So if you just use any combination of the things that I showed just there, then you can build up and change or set permissions however you like. So the other method of doing it is with the binary mode editing. And there we use a string of 3 digits that define our permissions exactly. So the first digit is going to be the permissions that we are assigning to our owner. The second digit is the permissions that we are assigning to our group. And then the final digit is going to be the permissions that we're assigning to everyone else. So the way that these digits are built is each of them is a 3-digit binary number, where the 4's place represents read permissions, the 2's place is write permissions, and the 1's place is execution permissions. So let's say we want the user, the owner, for instance, to be able to do absolutely everything. Well, then we have 4 for read, 2 for write, and 1 for execute. 4 plus 2 plus 1 is 7. So that's going to be our permissions for that. Let's say we want the group to be able to read and execute, but not write. So that's going to be 4 for read and 1 for execute is 5. And let's say we want the group to just be able to read. That's just going to be a 4 for read. So if we do that, then we can take that permissions and let's apply those to our restricted file instead and see what that's going to look like now. So if we apply that to our restricted file and then we ls-l again, you'll see that those are set exactly like we just defined, where the user has permission to do anything, the group has permission to read and execute, and everyone else has permission to just read. So to do that, that's the binary mode. So the other thing you may want to do is change who the owner of a file actually is. So to do this, you use the chown or change owner command. So that's going to be like that. And the syntax for that is going to be user colon group, and then the file whose permissions you want to change. So once you put that in, that is going to change the owner to that. You will need to either be the current owner of the file or a super user to do this. I don't have any other users configured on my computer, so I can't really demonstrate this, but if you do have other users on your computer, you can go ahead and play around with this a bit. And that's going to change who the owner is so that you can do permissions based off of that. So then that is pretty much it for those sort of permissions. And finally, we can see an example of sudo in action. If I am just going to try to run /, let's say we have that superstring, right? So if I just were to run /super.sh, you're going to see that I'm prompted for a password. So that's because this script uses the sudo command in it. So once we hit that sudo command, it's going to ask me for a password. If I type in the wrong password here, we're just going to get sorry, try that again, because that's not the right password, and therefore we can't be authenticated as sudo user, and we can't run this script. But if I go in and put my actual password in, then we'll see that the script executes as we expect. So that is an overview of executables and file permissions. I hope you enjoyed. That's going to be all for today. I'm going to continue making videos in this series in the future, but if you're really just doing basic stuff in the shell, I think this is really all of the core foundation that you need in these last 3 videos. So you could stop watching now and just try to figure things out on your own, for instance, but I will be talking about different, more advanced shell topics in the future, so be sure to stick around for that, and we're going to be moving on to other technologies as well. We're going to be talking about how to use Git for version control, the clean and professional way, because a lot of people do it wrong. And then we'll also go into talking about different technologies and programming languages. I'm thinking of doing Python and C in the near future as well. So be sure to stick around for that. Stick around for future episodes in this series as well. And that is going to be all for today. Drop a like if you enjoyed this video. Be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss future videos from me and the future of the Tech by Example series. So thank you for watching, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.